In 1971, if you wanted the smoothest, quietest ride money could buy, everybody knew the answer. You bought a Cadillac. That was not up for debate. Cadillac had spent decades building that reputation, one plush, silent, floating mile at a time. So when Ford ran ads that year claiming their family sedan, the Ford LTD, rode quieter and smoother than a Cadillac, most people assumed it was just another empty slogan from an ad agency on Madison Avenue. A bold claim with nothing behind it. Except it wasn't empty. Independent road testers who put the LTD up against the big Cadillacs, the big Buicks, the big Chryslers of the day, kept coming back with the same surprising verdict. This ordinary, mass-produced family car actually rode better. Not almost as good, better. And once you understand exactly what Ford's engineers did underneath that sheet metal, the claim stops sounding like marketing and starts sounding like one of the smartest and strangest engineering decisions to come out of Detroit that whole decade. But real quick before we start, comment the classic car you want us to cover next. The comment with the most likes becomes our next video. Okay, let's get into it. The LTD did not start out as a flagship. It began life in 1965 as nothing more than a fancy trim package bolted onto the Ford Galaxy, a way to squeeze a little extra profit out of buyers who wanted leather where cloth used to be. Nobody in Dearborn thought they were launching a legend. But by 1971, that little trim package had grown into one of the most successful nameplates Ford had ever built. In 1970 alone, Ford sold roughly 370,000 LTD models, once you count the Country Squire wagon versions riding on the same platform. That is enough cars to keep an entire assembly plant, and then some, running around the clock for a full year on the LTD nameplate alone. The Galaxy, once the star of the lineup, had fallen behind at around 320,000 units. The stripped-down Custom trailed even further back, a little over 110,000. The message inside Ford's sales figures was impossible to ignore. Customers wanted the nicer car, they wanted the extra chrome, the softer seats, and the badge that said they had moved up a rung from the plain Galaxy parked in their neighbor's driveway. They wanted the LTD. So for 1971, Ford made a decision that would define the entire model going forward. Instead of protecting the LTD as a mid-pack seller, they were going to push it further upmarket, chase Cadillac's territory directly, and see how far a Ford badge could actually go. That decision led to a complete visual overhaul for 1971, and the most obvious change sat right up front, in a new nose that borrowed its shape from one of Ford's other stars. But the sheet metal was really just the surface. The real reason this car ended up riding better than a Cadillac was hiding somewhere nobody thought to look, buried in the way the body itself was bolted to the frame. We will get to exactly what Ford's engineers did in a minute, because it is genuinely clever, and it explains everything about how this ordinary family sedan pulled off something the far more expensive cars from Cadillac and Chrysler could not manage. Before we get into that, one quick thing. Quick thing before we carry on. If you own a classic car, or you're thinking about buying one, I made something for you. It's a 50-page guide called Know What It's Worth. Here's what it does. It teaches you how to check a car yourself, the numbers stamped on the body, the engine, the tags under the hood, and find out two things: whether it's the real thing or a fake, and what it's honestly worth today. Takes about 20 minutes with a flashlight. You don't need to be a mechanic. It's at classiccarshistory.com. The link is in the video description. Alright, back to it. Now, back to that new nose. For 1971, Ford gave the LTD a completely redesigned front end, built around a pointed, beak-shaped nose that looked strikingly similar to the previous year's Thunderbird. It was sharp, it was distinctive, and it immediately separated the new car from the softer, rounder front ends Ford had been running for years. But that redesign also took something away. The hidden headlights that had given earlier LTD models a cleaner, more expensive-looking face disappeared entirely. That feature did not vanish from Ford Motor Company altogether. It simply moved up the ladder to the Lincoln Mercury division, leaving the LTD with conventional exposed headlamps instead. It was a small thing on paper, but it told you exactly where Ford wanted this car positioned. Impressive, but not quite allowed to outshine its more expensive siblings. The back of the car told a similar story, only this time the story was about which trim level you could afford. Ford abandoned the old twin round taillights, the ones people nicknamed jet exhausts because of their shape, and replaced them with a single horizontal light bar running the full width of the rear end. On the top trim, LTD, every section of that bar lit up, giving the car a wide, continuous glow at night that looked far more expensive than its price tag suggested. Step down to a Galaxy 500, and the center section of that same bar went dark, filled instead with a plain aluminum trim panel. Step down again to the base Custom 500, and that center section was simply painted body color, no chrome, no light, nothing. Same basic car, same basic light bar, but Ford used it to draw an unmistakable visual line between how much you spent and how much glow you got to take home. Along the sides, sharp new feature lines ran the length of the body, paired with a formal, upright roofline that gave the whole car a more serious, more grown-up stance than the model it replaced. Step inside, and the story shifts again, this time towards something a little more surprising. Ford actually simplified the dashboard for 1971, dropping the deep, wraparound, cockpit-style instrument cluster of earlier years in favor of a flatter, still handsome panel. But simplified is putting it kindly. The gauges themselves were almost non-existent. You got a speedometer, a fuel gauge, and if you paid extra, a clock. That was essentially it. Oil pressure, engine temperature, alternator output, all of that information came to you not through actual gauges, but through small warning lights that only illuminated once something had already gone wrong. In other words, there was no real way to keep an eye on what was happening under that hood while you drove. You just had to trust the car, and hope the warning lights stayed off. What the LTD lacked in gauges, though, it made up for in seating, and this is where things get genuinely interesting, because Ford did something here that even Lincoln, its own luxury division, would not do. The top trim, LTD, Brougham, came standard with high-back seating, the kind with tall, wraparound headrests, built right into the seat structure, extremely comfortable on a long highway trip, and upholstered in some of the nicest fabrics Ford offered that year. Standard, not an option you had to pay for. Just there, the moment you drove the car off the lot. Now compare that to the rest of the industry. Over at Mercury, the Marquis Brougham's standard bench seat did not have high backs at all. If you wanted them, you had to specifically order the twin comfort lounge seat option and pay extra for the privilege. Lincoln's Mark III offered high-back seating, sure, but here is the part that should stop you in your tracks. The full-size Lincoln Continental, Ford's actual flagship luxury car, the one supposedly sitting above everything else in the lineup, did not offer high-back seats at all. Not standard, not optional, not available at any price. A buyer walking into a Ford dealership could option a mid-range LTD Brougham with better seating than the most expensive Lincoln Ford built that year. Over at General Motors, the picture was just as lopsided. Not a single division except Cadillac could match that kind of standard high-back seating. Chrysler came closer, offering similar seats across select models in their own lineup, but even they did not make it standard the way Ford did on the Brougham. It is a strange little detail, easy to miss, but it tells you something important about how aggressively Ford was chasing the luxury buyer with this car, sometimes even at the expense of its own more expensive nameplates. And all of that, the nose, the taillights, the seats, still was not the real story. The real story was underneath, in a decision Ford's chassis engineers made that almost nobody outside the company noticed at the time, and it is the entire reason this car earned its reputation. Here is what Ford actually did. When you build a body-on-frame car, which almost every American full-size sedan was in this era, you have to bolt the body down to the separate steel frame underneath it at various mounting points. Every one of those mounting points is a potential path for road noise and impact harshness to travel straight up from the pavement, through the frame, through the mount, and into the passenger cabin. Fewer mounting points, in theory, means fewer paths for that harshness to travel. Ford's engineers took that idea and pushed it about as far as it could go on this platform. On the 1971 LTD, there were no mounting points at all connecting the body to the frame, anywhere from the front cowl, that is the structure just behind the engine bay, all the way back to the rear package shelf, behind the back seat. Think about how much of the car that covers. The entire passenger compartment, floor to roof, front seat to back seat, was essentially isolated from direct contact with the frame underneath it. Road impact, pavement seams, sharp bumps, all of that energy had to travel a longer, more indirect path before it ever reached anyone sitting inside the car. By the time it got there, most of the harsh edge had already been absorbed. Ford paired that structural isolation with deliberately soft springs and soft shock absorbers, tuned for cushioning rather than control. Put those two things together, an isolated body structure and a suspension tuned purely for comfort, and you get a car that genuinely does ride quieter and smoother than heavier, more expensive competitors that were still transmitting far more of that road harshness directly into the cabin through conventional body mounting. Ford was not exaggerating in those advertisements. Independent testing backed it up. This really was one of the quietest riding cars sold in America that year, full-size Cadillacs included. But every engineering decision comes with a trade-off, and this one came with a big one. All that isolation, all that softness, bought a pillowy ride at the direct expense of handling. Take an LTD into a corner with any enthusiasm, and the car leaned hard, the steering felt vague, and the whole structure that had just spent so much effort keeping the road out of your spine now worked against you the moment you actually wanted to change direction quickly. And this is where the comparison to Chrysler's full-size cars gets interesting, because it flips the usual story on its head. The big Mopars of this era, the Furies and the New Yorkers, handled noticeably better than the Fords. Their torsion bar front suspension gave them tighter body control and more confident steering, but they rode significantly harsher. Every bump you avoided feeling in the LTD, you felt in a Chrysler. So the Fords rode better, the Chryslers handled better. Neither one did both, and buyers had to pick a lane depending on what actually mattered to them on a daily basis. Here is the part that should genuinely frustrate you a little, though. Ford did not force anyone to accept that trade-off. Buried on the option sheet for every full-size Ford that year sat something called the Firm Ride and Handling Package, and it cost $20. $20 on a car that could run well past $4,000 once you optioned it up. For that $20, you got firmer springs, firmer shocks, and a car that behaved noticeably more like a standard suspension Chrysler of the same period, tighter, flatter, more controlled through a corner, while still keeping most of that quiet, isolated body structure underneath. It was, by almost any measure, the best $20 you could spend on a 1971 Ford, and almost nobody checked that box. Most buyers walked past it entirely, never even noticing it existed, and drove home instead with the soft, floaty setup that Ford had built as the default. The option that would have fixed nearly everything critics complained about sat quietly on the order form, virtually ignored, for the entire production run. Underneath all of that chassis engineering sat a lineup of engines that, on paper at least, looked fairly straightforward for 1971. The standard engine was a 351 cubic inch V8 with a 2-barrel carburetor, rated at 240 horsepower. Step up, and you could get a 400 cubic inch V8, also with a 2-barrel, rated at 260 horsepower. Above that sat the big 429 cubic inch V8, available with either a 2-barrel carburetor producing 320 horsepower, or a 4-barrel version producing 360 horsepower. Those were healthy numbers for a full-size family sedan, and combined with that low-end torque these big blocks were known for, the LTD moved with real authority, despite its considerable size and weight. If you had bought one of these cars new in 1971 and parked it in your garage, you would have owned, without realizing it, one of the last examples of something that was about to disappear from the American car industry entirely. Because 1971 was the final year Ford advertised horsepower the old way, and what happened next changed how every single one of these engines looked on paper, even though almost nothing about the engines themselves actually changed underneath. Up through 1971, American automakers rated their engines using something called SAE gross horsepower. That number was measured with the engine essentially stripped down for the test, no air cleaner attached, no accessories running, and often with a less restrictive open exhaust rather than the full exhaust system the car actually drove around with. It was, by design, the most flattering number you could possibly generate. For 1972, the industry switched to SAE net horsepower, measured with everything installed exactly as it would sit in your driveway. Air cleaner on, accessories running, full exhaust system in place, load on the alternator, the works. That single change alone would have dropped the advertised numbers significantly, but Ford also made a second change at the exact same time. 1971 was the last year of Ford's high-compression engines. For 1972, compression ratios were cut across the board, so these engines could run on regular fuel instead of the premium, higher-octane fuel the old high-compression versions required. Two changes, stacked directly on top of each other, hitting every engine in the lineup at once. The result looked, on paper, like a catastrophic collapse in performance. That same 351 cubic inch engine that made 240 horsepower in 1971 suddenly showed just 153 horsepower for 1972. The 400 cubic inch engine dropped from 260 down to 172. And the big 429, now standardized with a 4-barrel carburetor across the board, showed just 208 horsepower, a number that looked almost embarrassing next to the 360 horsepower version sold only 1 year earlier. Read those numbers cold, with no context, and you would assume Ford had gutted these engines overnight, turning genuine performance machines into sluggish, watered-down family cars practically overnight. Except that is not actually what happened, and this is the part that trips up a lot of people even now, decades later, when they are shopping for one of these cars. The 400 and 429 cubic inch engines in the 1972 LTD still drove far stronger than those net horsepower numbers on paper suggested. These were big displacement engines, built around enormous low-end torque. And torque, not peak horsepower, is what you actually feel pulling away from a stoplight in a 2-ton family sedan. The measuring stick changed dramatically. The actual experience behind the wheel did not change nearly as much. It is one of the more misunderstood chapters in early 1970s Detroit history, and the LTD sits right at the center of it. The smaller 351, on the other hand, really was on a genuine downward slide. It was never a fast engine, even in its strongest 1971 form, and it kept getting weaker as the decade wore on, eventually morphing into the heavily smog-controlled 351M engine. Later in the decade, a low-output unit that bore only a distant relationship to its stronger ancestor. That shift was not unique to Ford either, even though the LTD makes an especially clear example of it. Every American manufacturer went through the exact same gross-to-net transition at essentially the same moment, and every single one of them saw advertised horsepower numbers fall off a cliff on paper, even on engines that had barely changed underneath the valve covers. Tightening emissions requirements and rising insurance premiums on high-output engines were already pushing the entire industry toward lower compression, more conservative tuning, regardless of how the numbers were measured. The 1972 model year gets remembered, fairly or not, as the year the muscle car era started to lose its nerve, and the LTD's own paper horsepower collapse is a small but very real piece of that larger, industry-wide story. 1972 brought a handful of other changes as well, and one of them came directly from Washington rather than from Ford's own design studio. A new federal rule required cars to survive a head-on impact into a barrier at 2.5 miles per hour without sustaining damage, and that meant a revised front bumper for the LTD to meet the new standard. The bigger visible change, though, sat at the rear. That full-width horizontal light bar Ford had introduced just 1 year earlier, the one that had done so much to separate the LTD visually from the lower trim Galaxy and Custom models, was gone already, replaced by 2 separate stop lamps built into the bumper itself. It was a surprisingly short-lived design, on the car for a single model year, before Ford moved on to something else entirely. Buyers who wanted an LTD in 1971 or 1972 had 4 different body styles to choose from. A 2-door coupe, a 4-door hardtop, without a center pillar for that open, airy look, a more traditional 4-door sedan, and, for the last few buyers who still wanted one, a convertible. Across all of those body styles, the driving experience stayed remarkably consistent. These were excellent, dependable daily drivers, especially the versions running the simpler 2-barrel carburetors, which tended to need less fuss and less maintenance than their 4-barrel counterparts. The engines themselves ran nearly silent under that isolated hood structure. The Brougham interior, with those standard high back seats we talked about earlier, made an absolute case for itself on any long-distance trip. The kind of car you could drive for 6 or 7 hours and step out of feeling almost as fresh as when you got in. Just do not expect it to reward you in a corner. The suspension, even with the softer standard tuning left in place, meant this was never going to be anyone's idea of a sporty sedan, and honestly, very few full-size American cars of this era were. Ford had simply made a more deliberate choice than most of its competitors to lean all the way into ride comfort and to let handling take a back seat. Ford knew exactly what story it was telling with this car, and its advertising campaign leaned into that story with real confidence. One of the 1971 television spots featured Rod Serling, the writer and host best known for The Twilight Zone, standing in for Ford to make the pitch himself. The theme of the ad was simple and a little philosophical for a car commercial. The world was getting noisier every year, Serling argued, but quiet cars come from strong cars, and Ford built strong cars. He called the 1971 LTD one of the quietest riding Fords the company had ever produced, closing with the familiar line, "Ford gives you better ideas." There is an odd little footnote to that commercial worth knowing. Serling was under 50 years old when it was filmed, though he looked considerably older on camera, and he passed away only a few years after that ad aired. At the time, though, using a serious, thoughtful voice like his to sell a family sedan on quietness rather than horsepower was a genuinely unusual choice, and it worked because it matched exactly what the engineering underneath the car was actually delivering. A second 1971 commercial took a completely different approach, built entirely around structural rigidity rather than ride comfort. This one focused on the steel guard beams Ford had built into the doors, comparing them directly to the guardrails you would see running along the edge of a highway. To prove the point, Ford filmed the entire car, more than 2 tons of 1971 Detroit steel, being lifted entirely off the ground, using nothing but those door guard beams as the lift points. No frame support underneath, no crane hooked to the chassis, just the beams inside the doors themselves, holding the full weight of the car in the air. It was a dramatic, memorable demonstration, and it tied directly back into the same body and frame design that gave the LTD its quiet ride in the first place. The commercial closed with a simple, confident line, "Built strong to last longer." Worth noting, door guard beams were not some secret Ford invention that no other manufacturer had. Structural door beams were becoming increasingly common across the industry as the early 1970s brought a growing focus on crash safety. But Ford leaned into the marketing around them harder than almost anyone else, turning a safety feature into a genuine selling point at a moment when American buyers were starting to think seriously about what happened to their car, and to them, in a real accident. That shift in attitude did not come out of nowhere. The federal government had only recently begun setting real safety standards for passenger cars, and side impact protection, door strength, and bumper requirements were all becoming part of the national conversation in a way they simply had not been a decade earlier. Ford's choice to hang an entire commercial on lifting a 2-ton car by its door beams was not just a stunt. It was a direct response to buyers who were starting to ask harder questions about what stood between them and the pavement in a crash, not just how quiet the ride felt on the way there. There is also a quieter piece of trivia buried in that same 1971 lineup that rarely gets mentioned. That standard high-back Brougham seating we talked about earlier was not just a comfort feature. It was doing double duty as a piece of that same safety story, offering better head restraint positioning than the low-back bench seats still common across most of the rest of the industry. Ford never advertised it that way directly, choosing instead to sell the seats purely on comfort and luxury. But the timing lines up with everything else the company was doing that year, chasing comfort, chasing quiet, and chasing a slightly safer, more modern image, all inside the same nameplate, all at the same time. So here is where all of this actually lands. The 1971 and 1972 Ford LTD was never going to outcorner a sports sedan, and it was never going to satisfy a driver who wanted sharp, responsive handling. That was simply not what it was built to do. But on the single question its advertising actually asked, could an ordinary American family car ride as well as, or better than, the most expensive luxury cars sold in the country that year, the LTD delivered a genuine, verifiable yes. A no mounting point body structure, isolating the entire passenger cabin from the frame beneath it. Deliberately soft springs and shocks, tuned purely for comfort. A $20 option almost nobody bothered to check that would have balanced the whole equation if only more buyers had known to ask for it. That is the real story behind why a Ford outrode a Cadillac in 1971. Not a marketing trick, not an exaggeration, but a specific, deliberate engineering choice that most of the people driving these cars every single day never fully understood, right up until the moment they hit a rough patch of road in a Cadillac and wondered why their neighbor's Ford felt so much calmer doing the exact same thing. One last thing before we finish, and it's the important one. I made a 50-page guide called Know What It's Worth. If you own a classic, or you want to, this is the one thing I'd put in your hands. It teaches you to check a car yourself, where the numbers are stamped, what they mean, and how to tell when somebody's changed them. 20 minutes with a flashlight, and you know whether you're looking at the real thing or a very good story. Then it tells you what to do about it. How to buy one without paying real car money for a fake. How to sell one without losing a third of it in fees. And how to write it all down in one folder. So if the day comes when you're not here, your wife or your son doesn't sell that car to the first stranger with a trailer for a fraction of what it's worth. 50 pages, big print, made to be printed out and kept with the car. It's at classiccarshistory.com. Link is in the video description. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.